So that last presentation was fascinating, and I really enjoyed it. And I thought it was a great segue to some of the discussions we're going to have here. So on behalf of Professor Silver, as Cynthia said, he's not able to attend today. I'm going to speak very briefly about some of our findings. I want to take this opportunity to invite all of you. I don't know if I have the authority to do this now, but I'm going to do it anyways. On December 10th, the research that this presentation is built on is actually going to be released. So as Cynthia was alluding to, I can't technically, well, I guess I could, but I can't technically go through the details of what the research found. I'm going to give you some brief synopsis of sort of 4 of the real key trends we identified. But on the 10th, December 10th, at the Thunderbird Lodge, Thunderbird House, the actual paper is going to be released as part of the State of the Inner City, 2015 State of the Inner City report. So, hey, tell them Darren sent you. You're welcome to attend. It's going to be put through on behalf of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Again, I'm not involved with them, so I'm actually inviting you. I don't know if I'm allowed to, but I'm encouraging you all to come. So let's talk a little bit about, see if I can figure out how to advance these. There we go. A little bit of background. You'll notice right away when I talked about Professor Silver and I not necessarily being that in tune with software and things of that nature, you're going to notice some pretty boring slides, but bear with me on that. The background for the research was about 15 years ago, Professor Silver and the late Professor Earl Black, who used to teach at the University of Brandon, the 3 of us sat down and we looked at some data. We had access to custom data, and there's actually several familiar faces in this room today who I worked with and who are familiar with the data that was available to us. In 2000, we published a paper called High and Rising, the Growth of Poverty in Winnipeg. And we used custom census data to look at custom geographical areas. We used neighborhoods, and I'll talk a little bit about neighborhoods as a unit of analysis. The earlier presentation talked about census tracts. It's important for people who are becoming researchers, who may not necessarily be, or people who are sort of looking at different data sets, to be aware of the distinction between neighborhoods and census tracts. There are approximately, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, 176 census tracts in the city of Winnipeg as of 2011. There are 230 neighborhoods. And the neighborhood data allows for a little bit more detailed analysis. One of the best examples I like to show or talk about is the fact that 2 neighborhoods that I'll highlight in a second here, Armstrong Point and West Broadway, are 2 individual neighborhoods as part of the neighborhood characterization areas. But they form one census tract tract 015. So when you're using census tract data, you're not able to differentiate some of those real distinctions that the neighborhood data allows you to do. So it's custom geography, and custom geography also allows us to ask Statistics Canada to prepare data at custom levels of geography, like the inner city. So we're able to look at the inner city as a distinct geographical area without running into issues of rounding and things of that nature. So Professor Silver, Professor Black, and I prepared this paper 15 years ago, and we were pretty shocked at some of the findings. Population declining in the inner city, a historical trend, labor force characteristics that were tremendously below what we saw in the non-inner city or citywide, very low unemployment or very low labor force participation rates, and we found very high incidence of poverty or low income. In fact, we found in 96 that 50% of households in the inner city had incomes below the low income cutoff line, and even higher for Aboriginal and First Nations and Aboriginal and single parent households. So it's pretty shocking, and we actually ended that paper with a call for action, saying that, you know, if we don't do something, we're at a threshold or a tipping point where if we don't do something, conditions are likely only going to get worse. So in the span of 15 years, move forward now to the current context, we've seen a significant amount of community-based initiatives in terms of trying to address some of the issues in the inner city. We now have neighborhood renewal corporations in several inner city neighborhoods. A whole range of initiatives, small and large, that have taken place And we were curious as to see what type of impact that may have had on the data. So we decided, Professor Silver approached me and said, well, you know, we should revisit that high and rising report. So we've come up with the original name of High and Rising Revisited. That's the name of the paper. And we decided we would look at the same data sets for as much as we could and just try and get a sense as to whether we can determine, we'll never be able to point to causality, but we wanted to get a sense as to what some of the numbers are saying now compared to what we saw 15 years ago for the inner city. And again, I'm not going to go into the specifics of what we found. You're all welcome to come see our presentation on December 10th and see the specifics. But what we found might be of interest to some of you. It might be a little bit contrary to what some of you have heard throughout the day or what you might be thinking about the inner city. And that is that the data appears to suggest that the inner city is showing signs of improvement. Population decline has been stemmed. In fact, since 2001, population in the inner city has been growing. We're seeing labor force characteristics that were quite startling in terms of their improvement. In 1996, the gap between the labor force participation rate, the inner city and non-inner city population, was 8 percentage points. It's now 3 percentage points. It's narrowed. There's still an issue, and there's still challenges, but we're seeing a narrowing of some of the gaps that we traditionally identified as being characteristic of the inner city. Educational attainment levels are improving. There's still a lot of work to be done. 20% of the inner city population in 2011, according to the National Household Survey, and I'll talk a little bit, some of you may have already alluded to some of the data challenges that resulted as a result of the change to the National Household Survey. And that's a real issue for us in this context, as for many of you, I suspect. But educational attainment levels, 20% of the adults 25 to 64 years of age in the inner city had less than a high school education. That's double what it is in the non-inner city. But in 1996, it was 44%. And poverty rates, and this is an issue that people are, when we talk to people about what we found, people look at us and say, are you sure? Because that's not really what I'm seeing on the ground. And this isn't actually okay. One of the things I love to remind people is that data have limitations, and that data are simply one tool of understanding our city. So I love data. I'm a quantitative guy. I'm not much of a qualitative guy. I love numbers. People annoy me, but numbers I love. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to admit that. But the fact is that what we're seeing is that poverty rates in the inner city for households have been dropping considerably over the last 15 years. So we're starting to see, even though there's still tremendous distinctions between the inner city and the non-inner city, we're not saying things are good. There's still lots of work to be done. But we're seeing signs. The last presentation talked about, he ended the presentation talking about hope. We're seeing signs of potential hope. And our argument here is, again, we can't statistically prove causality, but our argument is, if these numbers are correct, maybe we should continue to look at investing in small community-based initiatives that look at building capacity with individuals and community-based organizations and things of that nature. It's the debate between, you have one large mega project that creates 100 jobs, or do you have 10 small projects that create 10 jobs each? And the reason this is interesting is because throughout this time, the last 15, 20 years, we've also seen, actually a lot longer than that, since the 80s, there were several programs, Core Area Initiative, Neighbourhood, I can't even remember what the one that followed the Neighbourhood Core Area Initiative, Winnipeg Development Agreement, and there was one other one. So we saw a lot of investment in the inner city, and we can't really say for sure whether the community-based investment is having the impact or whether it's a cumulative effect. But the argument we're trying to make is, if people are looking at West Broadway as a prime example, people are now looking at West Broadway and saying, well, it's turned the corner. Now we could start looking at investing in River Heights and Transcona and things of that nature. And maybe that's the case. Maybe there is a case to be made for investing in other neighborhoods and other areas in the city. But our argument is, don't necessarily think that the job has been done completely. So let's not lose sight of continuing to focus on investment and capacity building in the inner city. So that's sort of the premise of where we came from and what we've done. I'll talk very briefly about research limitation. In fact, I'll abbreviate this very much. But one of the things that as researchers you're going to encounter, as new researchers, as students, or as researchers who are out working, you're going to encounter a lot of issues. One of the challenges is, how do you define the inner city? What's happened to the boundaries of the inner city? Between 96 and to now, the inner city boundary changed. So we actually have to go back and readjust all the data so that we can account for the additional neighborhoods, so that we can make fair comparisons. So you need to, these are skills that good researchers are going to learn and recognize. And also recognize the issues of data limitations. Again, I won't go into, I used to work for Statistics Canada. I worked for Statistics Canada at the time that the National Households was announced. I no longer work at Statistics Canada. I could spend an hour. You let me, I will. I'm not kidding. I'll spend an hour on the stupid decision that it was to introduce the National Household Survey, to replace a mandatory census with a voluntary National Household Survey. On the one hand, the data at the provincial and national, even at the census metropolitan area level, the data is actually pretty good from the National Household Survey. I don't dismiss it offhand. Where the real challenge is, where 2011 will be a black hole forever, is in small area data. Because the census was the really only, well, we're moving now towards tax filers and things of that nature, but the census was traditionally the only source of good, reliable, small area data that allowed us to look at neighborhoods and allowed us to look at cross-tabulations of neighborhoods. So we could look not just at the census tracts or the profiles that are a flat file, but look at variables combined to see the interaction. And so one of the challenges we found with this data is the results we've seen from 2011, are they real? You've all taken, well, I hope you've all taken statistics. You're going to recognize the issue in terms of sampling methodology. One of the issues of sampling is that the results you're going to get slightly different than what you had gotten if you had surveyed the entire population. There's a difference between statistics and parameters, population parameters and statistics. And that difference is counted by response bias and things of that nature. So one of the challenges we have here in trying to be optimistic about the trends we're seeing is, are the differences real? I'm going to focus more on population. Population and family type, those are actually from the census. So that data is good. It's the socioeconomic characteristics that we were talking about earlier, education levels, labor force characteristics, ethnicity, income. Those are the data where we have to question how good they are. So that was a real challenge for us going forward, as for all researchers, in terms of how to deal with it. And then, of course, the other challenge, and I won't go into it too much, is changing census variables. Again, an issue that you're going to encounter as a researcher, happens all the time. You have to deal with it. You have to make sure that you're comparing historical data accurately. So you need to be aware of, I hate to break this to you, but you actually have to read the census handbook and the census dictionary. I'm sorry, guys. So you need to be aware of the implications where changes in variables, particularly how education has changed in terms of how it's measured since 2001 census. In our case, the real change that impacted us was the move towards the low-income measure as opposed to the low-income cutoff line. Historically, the low-income cutoff line was the measure used to measure low income. Now the measure that Statistics Canada is reporting most predominantly is the LIM, the low-income measure. So we need to be aware of some of those challenges in terms of comparing different rates. The one good thing is, if you look at the different measures, the LIM, the LICO, the market basket measure, the rates differ, but the trends are the same. Inner city poverty rates are higher than non-inner city poverty rates, regardless of the measure. There's a distinction in terms of the magnitude. So those are some of the research issues. Again, won't go into too much detail. I felt like we needed to include some math. This is like peer pressure. It's a GIS, you got to include maths, right? So Cynthia was kind enough to prepare some maps for us, just to give you an indication of the inner city boundaries, and current boundaries. And we'll talk very little bit about one of the focuses I was going to focus on. Yes, please, go right. Okay, well, that's a very deep question, actually. Historically, and I won't go into too much time, but historically, there were certain characteristics that neighborhoods or areas had to share. They had to be contiguous. You couldn't have an inner city neighborhood. You couldn't gerrymander it like the states do. You couldn't. They had to be contiguous, and they had to share certain characteristics. Housing stock, age of housing stock was a prime example. There were a whole range of others. So for the most part, for example, Elmwood, Glen Elm, Chalmers, Luxton, those are neighborhoods that were added to the inner city after 1996. They actually have brought down the poverty rates, for example. If you look, when you readjust the earlier data with those neighborhoods, they actually have an influence in terms of the rates. And I can't really speak to why there's a decision to expand the boundaries of the inner city. It may be political. It may be reflective of a spread of inner city characteristics geographically. I can't speak to that. But, or no, please go ahead.
So this isn't your definition?
No. This is the definition of the inner city that created by what used to be called the Census Data Consortium, now called the Community Data Program. So this is one definition of the inner city. If you use census tracts, the boundary is going to be close, but it's not going to be exact. So you just need to recognize there's going to be distinctions. And that's fair. It's not the end of the world if your boundaries differ. You just need to make sure that your data users recognize that. So that's the boundary of the inner city that we were using. Population change, one of the sort of really interesting things is that we've seen since 2001, well, not significant, but at least the trend towards population decline in the inner city has been stemmed. In fact, we've seen some of the largest population gain in the inner city since in 40 years. Much of it appears to be driven by recent immigrants. So I wanted to build on, since I couldn't really talk about any of the other variables, and because population was a census variable, so this data is reliable, I wanted to sort of spend today, I won't go into much detail, but just talk about neighborhoods. We've already had a good discussion just from sitting in on the last presentation, about the importance of neighborhoods as a unit of analysis. And looking at how the population has changed over time. And some of the patterns that may or may not be emerging in terms of change over time with inner city neighborhoods. So there's 39 neighborhoods in the inner city. And we are seeing, I was going to speak, I'll just skip this. If I had time, I was going to go in to talk about using data as an effective way of conveying information. So instead of trying to present data in a long, arduous, hard-to-read table, you can present that same data in one individual map. And so that was my take on the GIS. Not necessarily the techniques involved, but how effective a data presentation tool it can be. So that's just an indication of the different population sizes in the neighborhood. So very large range in population sizes. So you have to be careful when you look at percentages and percentage changes when you're not comparing a neighborhood of 500 and percentage change in a neighborhood of 6,000. So population in 1991 by size, the population in 2011 by size. And these are just inner city neighborhoods. But the real interesting thing was what's happened to the percentage change over the last 15 years and over the last 5 years. And to see that even when we're seeing population increase overall in the inner city, we're still seeing neighborhoods that are struggling with the issue of population decline. The previous presentation talked about a couple of those neighborhoods just north of the Health Sciences Center. And those are neighborhoods that are still evident in terms of population decline. South Point Douglas is a neighborhood that is now standing out as an island of affluence in the middle of the inner city because of the redevelopment that's gone. We're also seeing an interesting pattern in terms of a westward trend, a westward flow, if you will, of population decline, inner city characteristics. So that's percentage change between 91 and 2011. This is percentage change in the last 5 years. So you start to see the impact in South Point Douglas. You see the continued decline in some neighborhoods, but no evident pattern that becomes clear when you look at the data by neighborhood. I'm gonna. It's 1:30. I haven't seen you cut me off, but I have a couple of other slides in terms of if you wanted to take this a little bit further. Again, I felt obligated. We sort of peer pressure will do that to you. I don't smoke, but if you can make me smoke, peer pressure. Cynthia and I were talking about, well, what would be the next step? And one of the things you could do is, if we were to look at these neighborhoods and say, well, what would happen if you did a cluster analysis? Nothing super advanced, nothing, principal component analysis or anything like that, but just a simple cluster analysis. Look at in terms of what type of trend or pattern emerges if you look at neighborhoods that cluster together in terms of similar characteristics, similar change patterns. And this is an example of what we would see if you looked at the neighborhoods, inner city neighborhoods, using a cluster analysis. Again, sort of distinct patterns or areas emerging even within the inner city. And a more recent cluster analysis of the inner city, more recent data, and again, particular evident distinctions emerging within inner city neighborhoods. So that's really all I was going to cover. So actually, Cynthia said, well, do you mind if we steal some of your time because we want to issue an award? And I said, sure, I don't have that much to cover anyways. So any questions?